gears now a little bit with from technology and blockchain to more geopolitical issues. So our next guest speaker today is Axel Kaiser, if I'm pronouncing this right, visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Axel is the executive director at the Foundation para el Progreso, and we'll talk about government interventionism and economic policy. Axel, thank you for joining us today. Yeah, I think you're on.
Can you hear me?
Your mic is a bit blurred.
I'll try that.
Oh.
Hear me better?
Oh yeah, now it's great.
Okay, yeah, okay, that's good.
Awesome.
Okay. So thank you very much for this invitation to speak about how the political economy of the world, probably of the Western world, will look like in the coming decade or in the near future as well. I've been studying this for some years, some decades even, and what you find usually is that measures that are put in place in times of crisis never go away. And so it's very hard to see an expansion of government that takes place at some point during a crisis, even during war times. And many of the measures that are introduced are kept in place. Now, of course, that's not the case if you take a look at the German economy, the way that it had been run by the Nazis and things like this. It dramatically changed thanks to the influence of Ludwig Erhard and a classical liberal, by the way, and social market economy philosophy. And it was also backed at some point by the occupation groups, by the Americans especially. So that's not what I mean, but I think a good example of this is the Great Depression in the United States. If you take a look at what happened after the crash in 1929, Herbert Hoover, who was the president, he began a huge program of government intervention in the economy. And some people say that he did nothing, but now we know that the real father of the New Deal was Hoover and not Roosevelt, who came after him. And what Roosevelt did was basically to deepen and to further develop these government interventions that that Hoover had put in place, and also introduce new ones, of course. And so many of the institutions created during the Great Depression, probably all of them, with few exceptions, never went away. And all this played a huge role in the creation of the welfare state in the United States, or something closer to a welfare state in the United States over the decades. And they kept expanding and expanding. Fannie Mae, which was at the epicenter of the last financial crisis, because along with Freddie Mac, that was created decades later, they were subsidizing basically, or buying all these mortgages and selling these mortgage-backed securities and financing the housing bubble. And well, Fannie Mae was a creation of the New Deal. And so this is an example of, and there are many, many others, of how institutions that are created in order to offer relief at some point, they become permanent because the political cost of getting rid of them is too high. And then you have interest groups, vested interests, of course, that that want to keep these institutions in place and benefit from them even. And so what is happening now in the world, what I will speak more about, mostly about the West, is that unprecedented measures of intervention, both from the fiscal side and also monetary interventions, have been implemented in a very short period of time. And because we have such a dramatic shock on the supply side, it means we are not producing, we are not selling stuff, we're not producing stuff. This is not a problem that has to do with aggregate demand, like economists like to say, but mostly with the incapacity of the economy because of the lockdowns to keep producing. And because of this dynamic we have now, these interventions that government is doing, I believe, are not going to go away. Maybe the scale will be reduced, but just as in the financial crisis in 2008, central banks promised, and they said that the massive monetary stimulus and the low interest rates, almost zero interest rates, in some cases negative interest rates, they were going to be there for a while until the economy recovered, and then they were going to normalize the situation, and QE was going to be reversed and all that. They tried to do that. The Fed tried to do some of that recently, but the markets immediately reacted because I think they're used to the monetary morphine. And so since we are not going to have a recovery, a V-shaped recovery, that's the way they call this very rapid normalization of the economic activity. Since we are not going to have that, I believe the case for maintaining these measures will be even more compelling than it used to be. So it is my opinion that we are entering a whole new phase that we could call the probably the Japanization of the Western economies. Why Japan? Because Japan introduced lots of interventionist measures and monetary stimulus, already for decades, and it's sort of a situation where you have very low growth, you have higher and higher debt, and it looks like they have reached a sort of an equilibrium in Japan, but the economy lacks dynamism. And there is also something that has to do with the homogeneity of the Japanese population that makes it easier probably to go away with very low growth rates and with lack of dynamism in the economy, that I don't think it's viable in the West. But still, these interventions, we have to understand, are huge distortions for the price system. So prices send signals, and these signals are crucial in order to allocate resources to different sectors of the economy. If you manipulate interest rates too much as a central bank, and I'm all in favor of abolishing central banks and going to a free banking system, but the reality is that we do have central banks, but if you manipulate interest rates for too long, what happens is you send the wrong signals. And so people start, probably if they are too low, they don't save enough. They start investing in long-term projects that are very sensitive to low interest rates. And then you have booms of the sort we had in 2000 and the 2000s with the housing bubble that burst in 2008 after the Fed had to raise rates because inflation was going up. So money is a crucial issue here, and prices and interest rates have to be those that the market dictate, and not those that central planners of central banks think are the appropriate rates for the economy. They have no way of knowing really what the natural rate is, interest rate is, and what it should be. So I'm very worried that these very, very low interest rates that we have had already for over 10 years and now are going to keep there being in place, are going to create enormous destruction in terms of the sound development of capital and the savings on the savings side, and creating huge stimulus for people to, if banks start really lending, to spend more than they should spend. And so we will have a problem from that part. And also, you see central banks now are buying everything that moves, basically. So they are picking winners and losers, something that the market should do and not central planners of any sort, and allocating credit. They are buying government bonds. Now the Central Bank of England, they are even financing the government directly. And this is that was like a taboo in the among economists, mainstream economists. Like you should never have central bank printing the money to give it directly to the government. If you buy government bonds or debt, you do it in the secondary market, not directly from the government. Well, you see now the central bank in England is doing precisely that, which gives also credit to some very crazy ideas like modern monetary theory that are going, around, and that people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others have been defending. Like, yeah, we can just print our way out to prosperity, and this is very dangerous. We have tried that in Latin America many times, and it has always ended up in disaster. So I'm very worried, because if you take a look also at the central bank in Europe, the ECB has been a very destructive force in Europe. That's my opinion. Other people think differently, but they are now monetizing debt. They have been doing it for a while, and they have basically said, we are going to print all the money that's necessary and buy everything that we have to buy, government debt or whatever, even corporate bonds and things like this. So when you have such a massive government intervention and you mess with money in that way, I believe that first, it's very hard to put an end to it, because the cost it's too high, and you can have really a disaster if you start selling all these assets that the central banks have purchased. You will have an immediate impact on interest rates and the value of these bonds and stuff they have in their balance sheets. So that's one thing. And then you create a system where people are dependent all the time on this stimulus, a monetary and fiscal stimulus. So the moral hazard of the whole system increases, and this is what happened after 2008. We have even more fragile financial system now, according to many measures, and that's a huge liability for the world economy. And if we do not really correct this problem, which I think we will never do, at some point you can have a fiscal crisis in countries like the United States, because the amount of debt you're accumulating, it's unsustainable. And what makes it possible to accumulate all that debt to a large extent is the willingness of central bank, of the Federal Reserve, to buy government debt. And so they have in their balance sheets, they have accumulated trillions of government debt. So this is something that is completely against all rules of sound monetary policy and sound fiscal policy. I'm not saying here nothing should be done in order to help certain businesses and to provide some assistance to solvent businesses that have liquidity problems. You probably can do things in order to help them. But the thing is that here we are going a step further, or many steps further than that. We are really starting to create a monster economy in which the shots are not being called by the markets anymore, but by central planners. And I don't see this ending in a very positive way. I think this is going to probably produce a catastrophe. In the short run, you might feel a relief. Yes, the shock is not as bad as it could be, but in the medium term, in the long run, what you will have is the inability of the economy to grow. This will create huge social problems. You will have mounting debt that will create also political problems. And it will destabilize, in my opinion, the system, the political system even, because you cannot take debt forever, and you cannot print money forever. And even if you have several deflationary forces playing a role right now, you have, of course, a lot of people unemployed, people are saving money, they are not spending, so these are deflationary forces. But I think in the medium and long term, the problem we will face is inflation, and higher numbers of inflation like we have not seen in a long time. This is an unprecedented intervention. The Fed has printed like 6 trillion or something in the last couple of weeks or months, or that's at least what they are planning to do, achieve that stimulus. And this is it's huge if we take into account that since the Fed was created in 1914 to 2008, they had created a base of 800 billion, and now it has multiplied in a decade by, what is it, a factor of 6 or even more. Now it's even more than that. Like it's really crazy when one thinks about it. And I don't know how they're going to implement an exit strategy now if they were incapable of doing it in 2008, when the crisis was much less severe in a sense. We did not have this huge destruction we are seeing now worldwide in terms of the real economy. And so I have to say that I'm very, very pessimistic. I think normality is not going to come back anytime soon. Times before this crisis were also not normal, with these huge liquidity injections and massive government interventions and governments accumulating debt, although some governments had done something in Europe to deleverage a little bit. But in general, we have a broken system. That's what I believe, and it has a lot to do with paper money and central banks, and these ability of politicians to be financed by, or the possibility they do have now to be financed by central banks. Since we don't have a gold standard, we got rid of that in Nixon put an end to the gold standard in 71. So in order to be able to print the money, no, to pay for the Vietnam War and for social expenditures and so on and so forth. So we could go into the details, but I prefer to provide a general picture, and we have to go back to basic economics. And the market is a spontaneous order, and the way that resources are allocated in a market system is by prices that are free and are not intervened by the government. And now we see people like even Paul Krugman suggesting we should fix some prices in the economy. This has all been tried before, and it has always failed. And what we really need to do is to shrink the size of government. We have to think about money in a different way. We have to probably, I don't know if cryptocurrencies will have the stability necessary in order to become real currencies, like generalized use. I hope so, but we have to enter a new discussion in terms of can we go on with a system that's based on paper money? Now it's electronic money, central banking and central planners manipulating interest rates, and now even allocating capital and doing fiscal policy, which was never the role of central banks. That was never intended to be like that. So I would also mention that the ideological battle is going to get more intense, in the sense that people who defend a limited market and who believe in freedom, private property, and I mean a limited government, an open market, and limited government, they are going to be have to be much more persuasive in defending these ideas, and it's very similar to what happened during the New Deal. Suddenly, even if the New Deal started before Keynes published the general theory, but suddenly it was all about government spending, and even now some economists, many economists actually, probably a majority of them, believe that Second World War solved the problem of the Depression, which is not true. It was not the war, like Robert Hicks has argued in one of his books about depression and war and Cold War. He has shown that that was never the case, and destruction and mobilizing the labor force so they can go to battle is not a good way to reduce unemployment, and you cannot not really take seriously an argument like that. But the idea that the New Deal was a fantastic program for recovering the economy and or dealing with the problems of the market system, the capitalist system, is very widespread. And this has created a myth, and FDR is seen like as a hero, while he was one of the main reasons why the Depression was so long in the United States. So I believe now there are differences, of course, and I hope there will be no war. And we have also other forces playing a role, like this whole fourth industrial revolution that could create enormous productivity gains, and from there we could save the day with that. But for now, what is very clear is that we are not living in a real free capitalist system anymore. It had not been the case for a while. The interest groups, lobbyists, and they were colluding with the politicians everywhere, in Brussels and London and Washington, everywhere. And I recommend a very good book by Luigi Zingales about this capitalism for the people, in order to have an idea of how capitalism has been corrupted in the United States. And now that the government is spending so much money, like there is no tomorrow, basically, like you could really print and borrow your way out of anything. This is going to be even worse. And I predict that we will have social unrest in many countries, in developing economies, in Latin America, that's for sure. And we will have defaults. Argentina is going to default, if we could even consider it has defaulted already, but it will default. We will have other countries in emerging markets having huge problems, which will create frustration and social unrest, and we will have people falling under the poverty line by the millions because of these crazy lockdowns, which I believe could have been reasonable at first because no one knew very much about the disease. But now, in my opinion, they don't make any sense, and the cost is going to be much greater than the benefit. So this is a very general picture I'm giving, and I hope we could go into more details in our discussion. But still, I want to end this comments by saying that, by quoting Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig von Mises, who in my opinion is one of the greatest economists in the 20th century, if not the greatest, he said that the greatest damage of depressions and economic crisis was not so much unemployment and the drop in economic activity and all that. It was the moral damage. It was the feeling that the market was not able to respond appropriately, and that the crisis was a product of capitalism and not of interventions by central banks and governments in the market economy. He predicted the 1929 crash, and he attributed it to the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and central banks, and no one believed him. And the 2008 crash was clearly a problem generated by artificially low interest rates by the Federal Reserve, if you ask me. And many people believe this as well, many economists. And so what we need to do is to encourage people that have interest in the money side of things to spread and defend the idea that government doesn't have to have a monopoly on money anymore. We need a free banking system or something like that, because this, I fear this might collapse at some point, creating a mess like we have never seen. And if that happens, we will have social unrest, we will have political crisis, unprecedented, maybe even, who knows, even war. So I hope not, and that would be the most pessimistic scenario. But if this really turns out the way that it could, because it's not impossible, and it doesn't look pretty. So what I'm saying is very likely, and so I would go back to the sound principles of classical liberalism that enable the West to grow prosperous, or in the social market economy of Ludwig Erhard, if you don't want to be like a very strict in terms of limiting government, but still have some reasonable free market where government sets the rules of the game and helps those that are not in a position to help themselves. But still, capitalism is the driving force, free competition, rule of law, and not the welfare state, and not central banks deciding where credit is going to be allocated, and all this very, very harmful policies we have been following over the last decades. So let's go back to the ideas of freedom, because freedom works, markets work, rule of law, and not welfare state and huge government spending. And also, unfortunately, we will see a process of deglobalization that will also have an impact on consumers, because supply chains are going to be more inefficient as they grow or become more local and less globalized. So as I said, I'm very pessimistic, and we have to speak about the benefits of freedom and defend the ideas of sound money and the markets as a response to solving social problems, and not government. That's the only way that in a democracy you can make changes, by changing the climate of opinion first, and then you have a shift in political economy, and can have a hope and a shot that in 15, 20 years, when people are tired of this system not working anymore, maybe they will take your ideas seriously, and then you will have reforms in order to bring back the foundations of prosperity. I think that's more or less what I had in mind to share with you, a general overview of the problem, and yeah. So if there are any questions, I'll be happy to.
Awesome. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Axel. Yeah, actually, we have a question from Patrick. I think you are allowed to talk.
Yeah, hi. Thanks for your talk. So, I mean, I think I have a very different, let's call it, socio-political point of view than you do. You seem to talk about a lot about money and how it affects the socioeconomic situation today. But I feel like you're ignoring a large part of this discussion, which is how governments choose to spend their money, so the fiscal side of it,
Right.
and the democracy that in a lot of Western countries that drives that. Can you bring that into the points that you're trying to make and maybe consolidate it with what your view of monetary policy has been?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I did not mention the fiscal side so much, or it didn't go, developing that point so much, because I believe money is even more important. You have to just, take into account that governments would not be able to spend so much were it not for central banks buying the debt. So if it wasn't for the Fed, you would have a spike in interest rates, and the American government, the U.S. government, would have to be more careful with spending. It is true that in a democracy, you have what Milton Friedman called the iron triangle. No, you have different groups, interest groups, deciding or pressuring, exerting pressure in order to direct resources one way or the other. And so what happens with the money that politicians spend? Well, you have the classical public choice theory that says that politicians in the end are maximizers of their own interest. And so the way they will spend the money is the way that benefits themselves. That doesn't mean they're stealing the money necessarily, but they will try to direct this money to interest groups and people that are important for them to be re-elected and their own constituency, even if it's not the most efficient way to spending the money. And of course, you have a problem in democracies where people vote for having government handouts and government some sort of government assistance. Like if you have a majority of the population that are retirees, for instance, it's very hard as a politician to say, okay, we are going to cut social security, or we are going to not pay you as high as a pension anymore, because they will not vote you anymore. So and you have that problem in Europe and also in the United States, but in Europe mostly, where you have a large part of the population, voters, that are retirees or about to retire. And yes, you have time bomb in terms of unfunded liabilities, but no one dares to do anything about it. Some governments have been increasing their retirement age, but that's not going to work in the long run. So so you have this tendency in democracies that Alan Meltzer, he wrote a very interesting paper many decades ago about this, showing that you have this tendency to redistribution in democracies. And so politicians, it's the old bribing people with their own money slogan, no? So it's a nasty way to put it, but to some extent, it's not that false, you know? So the fiscal side, you have to take into account also that the only way to pay people or to give people some social services or anything is by taxing them, because debt is a sort of deferred taxation. You take on debt, yes, but then you have to pay it at some point in the future. Otherwise, you have a default, and then you cannot provide the social services anymore. Anyways, or you have to monetize debt. And in that case, you have inflation, and then purchasing power is being reduced, and is more or less a default as well. So anything that government gives to anyone has to take it from someone else. And that's why I'm very skeptical about the role of government in all this. And also, we know this for a fact, this has been studied, that you have the lobbyists with offices in Washington and Brussels, everywhere in the capital cities, trying to get a slice of the cake, huge cake that government spends.
I mean,
And so, yeah, so I'm very, very pessimistic in terms of the ability of government to spend wisely.
I think that, I mean, you make some interesting points, but regardless of whatever monetary base any society decides to use, whether it's centralized or decentralized, there's always going to be a political game around how that money is created and used. I think that something that could be interesting, and I would love to hear your thoughts on this, is that put aside politics for a moment. Perhaps the metrics that we use in terms of how society makes judgments about how money is spent are fundamentally wrong. Like I would say that societies today are more oriented towards growth, which is the main driver for contracting debt. But if we saw it another way, say as the velocity of money, rather, perhaps we would be able to allocate resources more efficiently. What do you think about that?
No, I don't know. I mean, velocity of money is something that you cannot really control that much. It depends on different factors, inflation expectations and many other things. But if you have a free market, you know, like the one that the United States had for most of its history, I'd say the New Deal was a game changer, but you still had a free market, of course. It's not like everything went away. And during the New Deal, it was debatable to some extent, but after that, you could make the case that you know, you still had a free market, of course. But that's the best way to allocate resources, because that's the role of prices. I mean, there is no way the government can know where resources have to be directed, and there is no way. I mean, if you are talking about helping people who are poor, that's one thing. And even then, you have to be very careful in terms of, are you going to subsidize to give them the money, like in a negative income tax, for example, and you're going to do a supply support, or are you going to give them the money to demand? So people have the money and they can spend it, like the voucher system in schools or things like this. I mean, you know,
I would say that
with the banking system, you know, if you don't have a centralized banking system, there is no way that government can print money by using the central bank, because that's the only way they can do that is by having a central bank that's buying government debt. And central banks are going to do that regardless of whether the government is solvent or not, you know, and they're going to keep interest rates down artificially. You had a free banking system, that would not be the case, because banks that are going to load too much government debt, if the debt is getting riskier, they're going to lose their people are going to go for a run on those banks, and then the bank is going to be more careful. So government will have a limit, and that happened also with the gold standard, because the gold standard was sort of, you know, a safe in the sense that people would go and demand their gold back if the government was spending too much money and printing too much money, basically. So there is the fiscal side and the monetary side go always together, and inflation is, we know it's a monetary phenomenon, but it's closely tied to too much spending, to overspending. So yeah, so I think even Alan Greenspan, you know, he was in favor of the gold standard in the 60s when he was a young man. He wrote an article defending the gold standard, so government could not expand by printing money and using central banks to do it.
Yeah, it's a very interesting point. I don't know if anyone else has other questions, but if no one does, I don't mind asking a couple more.
Patrick, I think there's other questions here in the chat.
Other questions, yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll circle back to you in a couple of minutes.
Okay.
So there are many. I can start. So someone asked, are you familiar with the concepts introduced by Radical Markets by Glenn Weil? I'm not sure if you know about ideas like Hubbard's attacks, credit funding, voting, and ideologies such as like increasing returns economy. Have you any thoughts on this?
I've been, I don't know a lot about that. I've been mostly, you know, involved with the classical political economy studies and the ways they're working now. Yeah.
Okay, sure, that's fine. We have lots of questions. How should the U.S. federal government respond to the financial crisis hospitals in the U.S. face after stopping elective surgery and losing revenue while facing 1.5 to 2x expenses due to the coronavirus pandemic, short of cash relief from the Fed, as we have seen in the CARES Act?
Actually, if any of the people in the Q&A want to ask their question, just raise your hand and we'll give you mic access. But yeah, go ahead, Axel.
Yeah. So if you have an emergency and then you really need resources for the healthcare system in order to, you know, solve all these problems or to cope with this emergency, you have to provide these resources. I'm not saying government shouldn't play a role there. Some people who are experts on the healthcare system in the US have, you know, analyzed the way the whole system is distorted and incentives are not put in the right place, and that means government intervention has made everything more expensive and less efficient, and interest groups have benefited, and not necessarily people who are the consumers or people who are using the system. But still, it might be that if the only way to you know, provide assistance for these hospitals and people is it by the Fed intervening, well, okay, go for it. You are in an emergency. That's the only way you can do it. But I'm not so sure that's the only way you can do it. The thing is that the system, probably the healthcare system in the US, and I'm not an expert on that, it's an issue in itself, and some people spend their entire life studying that. But from what I've read, it's a system that needs an overhaul. And probably this will offer the opportunity to also, you know, think about the system again and how it has been dealing with this crisis. But I don't believe that the Fed should be involved in helping, you know, as a general rule, in helping anyone. The Fed should be there for, if it's there, that should be there for interest, for keeping inflation low. We know it has a dual mandate in the US, which I think is a mistake, but keeping inflation low, that's the role of the Fed. They shouldn't be, you know, doing health policy or anything like that. And if the government that would, you know, had more fiscal space, which in the US still has, because the dollar is the reserve currency of the world, but at some point they will not have anymore. But probably the government should step in and give more money, provide more, you know, relief to this to the healthcare system. I know it's a complicated issue because what are going to do with the next pandemic? Because it's going to come another one. The Fed is going to bail out and going to intervene in order, you know, to help people everywhere, or the healthcare system or hospitals. Is that the role of the Fed? I'm not so sure about that. Is it going to be normalized? What are the costs going to be of that? And why that sector and not others? Why don't we do it on a permanent basis? And that's why I fear we will have very high inflation in the future, because these sort of interventions might get naturalized. I hope I'm wrong, seriously, but you cannot print 6 trillion and expect to get away with it with paying no cost.
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense. So yeah, attendees, please, you can raise your hand and we can answer a question. Actually, I have a personal question. So yeah, we all agree on the bull market, the inflation that's been going on the past decade. And this might be the result of exiting the gold standard. And so that can only go for so long. And now we're seeing crypto rising. And so what about a potential crypto standard? Do you think that, for instance, Bitcoin-backed stable currency or Ethereum-backed stable currency, which will then bring the gold standard with skin in the game that we've seen was working, could be a great way, because it's much easier to use, to transfer, to store, of course. And so maybe that could be another way to rebuild a new foundation for the economy with some sound money.
Yes, you know, Hayek, the Nobel laureate, he wrote an article, a book called The Denationalization of Money decades ago. And he was basically saying, let's leave the market provide the money. And let's, let people decide which money we want. Now we are forced by government to use certain types of money because we have to pay taxes only with dollars or with euros or whatever. So there is and also you have a central bank that controls the money and also. So, but I believe, and there is a lot of discussion about this because some economists say, no, cryptos are too volatile, they cannot be money. You cannot have money, if Bitcoin, for instance, one day is $3,000, then 1 month later it's $8,000. That cannot be money. Money has to have a more stable value over time. But we don't know really yet if at some point, and I believe this is going to happen in the future, Bitcoin will stabilize. It might very well be the case that Bitcoin or Ethereum or one of these cryptos at some point in the future might take a while, but that they stabilize in price and that they become, used as money more frequently if technical issues are resolved, especially for many people who don't really know how to deal with these technologies, which is not so easy for many. So that can be an option, and it could also compete with other sorts of money, not necessarily crypto money. Maybe if you had a free banking at some point, you will have cryptos, you will have people issuing whatever the denomination of the money. Maybe you will have money also backed by gold again. Who knows? If you leave the markets to work, you will have different options, and then some of them will prevail and others will disappear. And it's a system we had in the past, not with crypto, of course, but with different sorts of money competing. And it was very successful in Scotland, for instance, and also in Chile, my country. The best banking system we ever had, according to all measures, was a free banking system, and in the 18th and the 19th century, and in other countries the same. So I'm very open to that, and I think it's the only way out of this disaster that the governments and central banks are doing with the regular money, with the traditional money.
Yeah, totally. That's why I thought like this would turn your pessimism into optimism, because I think this is neutral, just like gold backing, and this could be a great way. I actually disagree that Bitcoin will stabilize, or Ethereum. I think they're all inherently volatile because it's so easy to trade it on the free market, but we can build it as foundation, just like gold, to build stable currencies on top of it. And we've seen this, right, which is now a big company led by South American mostly, and it's really amazing to see them thriving now. Awesome. So do we have other questions? So there are questions about money printing. Maybe we can go over some of them. If you want to raise your hand, happy to let you talk. Or yeah, I can read one, and then we can maybe switch off to Patrick for if he has any more questions. So Louis, maybe I can unmute you first. Louis, yes, you are allowed to talk if you want to. Hello? Or else I can read your question. So the infinite impression of money by the central banks makes us think that they maintain the system. Do you think that there's a kind of Ponzi scheme hidden in the shadows that the government must keep? Which is kind of a weird question, but yeah, again, like the reasons of money printing.
I'm absolutely convinced that the welfare states in the West are a Ponzi scheme, and that are based upon, as I said, this paper money, and that they would not exist if we had a free banking or even a gold standard, because you have to take a look at how the price of money has evolved over time, like value of money, in the US and even in Europe, everywhere. And everywhere you see a decline in the value of money, the purchasing power of money. And this was not the case for a long time in the US, for instance, in the 19th century. And so it's I think it's a Ponzi scheme. It's sort of a Ponzi scheme, and the pension systems for sure. Pay-as-you-go system is a Ponzi scheme. That's 100% a Ponzi scheme. pay-as-you-go pension system like we have in Europe and most of Europe, for instance. And so, yeah, and the only way that can work for so long or for a longer period of time is by printing money, by the Fed printing the money that the federal government needs. It's the only way. If you had to pay that with real money, it would be impossible. And what do I mean by that? It means that retirees, and this is already happening, are seeing their quality of life decreasing every year because many things are getting more and more expensive. So yeah, there is no way around the fact that you have to produce the wealth that you are consuming. And what governments do and politicians do with this system is they spend more money than they would be able to spend if we had a gold standard, for instance, or if we had even a free banking system where they only could collect taxes and they could, only take so much debt like the market is able to provide financing for. And for instance, I close with this comment. In Chile, we have in the constitution an absolute prohibition of the central bank to buy government debt, even in the secondary market. This is very unique in the world. So we cannot buy government debt directly from the government, and most central banks cannot do that. But in Chile, we cannot even buy it from the secondary market, from bondholders, to perform open market operations in the central bank. Why? Because that would be an indirect way of financing the government. And because we had a history of hyperinflation, in the 1980 constitution, we put an end to that. So yeah, so I could go on, but that's basically my reflection on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Actually, there's someone from Chile asking a question. As a Chilean, do you believe then that social unrest there will not be possible to control once the virus crisis ends?
We had a huge crisis in October last year, and it lasted for many months. For people who are not familiarized with what happened in Chile, it was a complete collapse of public order, and a lot of violence, and subway stations were destroyed, and supermarkets were looted, and people died. It was a catastrophe. And once the virus is gone, we will have a huge economic crisis because of the lockdowns. And I believe violence is going to come back, not in a massive scale, at first at least, but it's going to come back. And I don't see the Chilean state with the capacity to react to violent groups. We already have a guerrilla in the southern Chile that is linked to cartels, even in Colombia and things like that. No one is doing anything about it. So there is no real rule of law in Chile. This is a fact, because the state has lost the capacity of enforcing the law. We have no law enforcement, and that is a result of decades of anti-police rhetoric and reforms that have made it impossible for them to. And I am all in favor of limiting the ability of government to, abuse people, of course. But you have to keep a sense of proportion in that, and we have lost that. And so you have activists also in the criminal courts that are very left-wing activists that are releasing all these people that commit crimes and also are persecuting and punishing the police officers that take them away. So I think it's a situation that will not be able to control for a long time.
Okay, nice. We have another question by text from Child Naraya9. So it goes, if we move to a setup without a central bank, what are your ideas on the kind of public institutions that would fill the space of conventional social security apparatus?
Well, that we don't have a central bank anymore does not mean necessarily that the government as such cannot have social policies in place. The thing is that they have to pay for that with taxes in an honest way. Let's put it this way. They have to tax you in order to pay for social security or whatever. And what they cannot do is to print the money and then spend it. And so they cannot expand beyond a certain limit. So you could have a free banking system, and then government would raise taxes, and and if people don't want to pay more taxes, then they would vote those Congress men and women out of Congress, and then so you would have sort of a control in that. But still, if we would really go to a 5% GDP type of government, which is my dream, it's like what the US had in the late 19th century. The civil society would do these things. Yeah, if you read Alexis de Tocqueville, Democracy in America, when he wrote this book in the 19th century, mid-19th century, he observed that civil society in the United States was so engaged and was so active in solving problems, from alcoholism to criminality to all sorts of education, all sorts of things. And this social capital has been eroded by the development of the welfare state. The welfare state has taken over this, has weakened society, has destroyed solidarity, true solidarity, and has made society poorer, and has also led to decrease in the ability to live together, because we used to come together in order to solve these social problems and to organize, communities, and all this has, to some extent, been affected by the welfare state, and also created perverse incentives for people to depend on the state, which is terrible. So I believe that, and in the same is, if you take a look at Argentina or Chile, even or the UK, many countries before the state expanded, you will see these private associations of individuals taking care for themselves. Even pensions and things like this were organized voluntarily by people who would put every month some money in order to have a sort of insurance in case one of them died, so the widow and the children would not be on the street. So these things would come back. They still exist, but not in the same with the same intensity, in the same way that they used to exist in olden times.
Awesome. Okay, cool. I think we have a question from Patrick again.
I have a question, I guess, that's kind of based off of this last question. In your vision of a quote unquote free banking system, what is the role of government in consumer protection, regulation, access to money? And why, I mean, I haven't really heard you justify why you think that would be better in terms of social stability versus what we have today. I mean, granted, there are lots of problems with the system that exists today, but I mean, I feel like it's a big jump to go from, governments contract debt that's creating that will lead to social unrest, and then, not have any justification as to why there wouldn't be in a counter scenario or in the opposite scenario.
So you would never have a perfect system, that's for sure. You have to compare advantages and disadvantages. Still, if you take a look at the literature and economic history, and you compare the era with central banks versus the era with free banking systems, you see better results with free banking systems. And in terms of inflation, in terms of crises, in terms of depressions, the duration of depressions, for instance.
There's so many confounders in that. It's impossible to say that it's directly linked to central banking.
No, yeah, you have many economists who have argued that.
And there are many that haven't.
Why George Selgin, for instance, you can go take a look at their work on banking. Even Milton Friedman said that you read one of his in Capitalism and Freedom, he's very critical of the Fed, and he has even an interview where he says you have to abolish the Fed. When he was very old, he said that. And of course, the Austrian school economists, all of them, no one among the Austrian school economists, they favor a central bank. So yeah, you could have, and if you had a central bank, maybe if you had an honest gold standard, then that would be also a good way to solve part of the problem I'm saying, or I'm describing here. But the free banking system has the benefits of the free market, that you can choose the currency you want to trade with, and you can control the banks in the sense that if you think your bank is issuing too much paper, then you withdraw your deposit, your bank can go bust, but not the whole system. And yes, you would have bankruptcies. Some banks will go away. That's capitalism. It's all sorts of businesses. You have companies that go away, that go bust. I don't see why banks should be any different. You wouldn't have a lender of last resort, which is a huge moral hazard, and the central bank has to play that role, a lender of last resort. And so yeah, it wouldn't be a perfect system, that's for sure. You would have problems. But overall, I think if you look at the evidence, you would have a more stable system, and you wouldn't have. And also, you have to remember, we are speaking not only about the central bank in the US. We are speaking about central banks all over the world. Like, take a look at Latin America, what central banks have done. Like, it has been a complete disaster. Like, hyperinflation everywhere. So it's even worse than anywhere else, So yeah, so I do believe that. I mean, we have the same experience in Chile, and all studies show that the free banking system in Chile was much better than the system with a central bank. So
you could very easily make an argument that that's due to the conditionality on loans put onto those countries by the IMF and the World Bank.
No, because in the 19th century you didn't have the IMF.
You don't have empirical information from the 19th century to be able to expound.
Sure. I do have empirical information about the central banking system in Chile and also in Scotland and Canada. I mean, the free banking system.
You can't ignore the founders. You can't ignore the founders.
You do have the records
that they're making.
You have the records of the banks, and you have very good economists who have done the.
Yeah, but we have very limited tax information. So just to put everything on the monetary system, tax records don't go back that far for many countries that you're referring to. So we don't have data in the same way that we do in modern history.
You do have. I'm talking about something different. One thing is the stability of the banking system and the duration of depressions and the price system. And prices you can measure. Has always measured. All been measured, and even you can go hundreds of years back, and they have been able to reconstruct prices. So that's one thing. The other thing is taxes, and that's also, you have records in many parts, even in Europe, in all churches, like how much money they would pay into the church. There was a form of taxation as well, and so you have pretty good evidence, I think. The economists have done a good job in reconstructing, in many cases, evidence about how the system used to work, in terms of the fiscal side as well as the monetary side. Of course, nowadays the information is much better, but I don't know. I wouldn't agree with you on that. Like, I think they have done a good job on economic history in that.
If you read Capital in the 21st century, we have limited information on so many countries. In fact, most of the tax information comes back from like the later part of the.
You mean the Piketty book, the one that's full of false statistics?
I don't know what you call a false statistic. I mean,
well, the Financial Times published an article showing that the statistics were wrong, that he used a lot of wrong numbers, and then you have other people who have refuted the whole book. Deidre McCloskey, Javier Salain Martin, Kevin Murphy, other professors have, I thought the book was interesting, but I wouldn't take it seriously, really. I mean, not because it's Piketty, it's because I think the book has several problems in terms of statistics and also in terms of theory. So
you're citing the
Austrians. I guess you can debate this for a long time, but I think most of the book is flawed. Yeah.
You're citing the Austrian school of economics, and that school is totally not based on any empirical information. It's all philosophized.
That depends what you read. If you go read Murray Rothbard's History of the Great Depression, it's full of statistics and empirical information. If you go read, Mises wrote a lot about the real economy of the Austrian Empire, for instance, and And Hayek got the Nobel Prize because his theories showed to be very, very useful for understanding the real economy, at least in terms of prices. And so, I mean, yeah, I'm not only talking about the Austrian school economists. I think many economists have something to contribute to the debate, and not only Austrian economists, also Chicago school economists and others that are not necessarily as free market oriented have made some interesting insights offered. So,
all right. I think we'll close here. Thank you so much, Axel, for this discussion.
yeah,
Next up,
thank you. No, thank you.